Picture this, March 9, 1985. A young couple, Edward Smith and Kimberly LaVine, wake up excited for a romantic day trip through Washington State's breathtaking landscape. They plan to visit Wanapum Dam, take photos, maybe grab lunch at a scenic overlook. It's the kind of day that creates lifelong memories. By sunset, they would both be dead. And their killer wouldn't stop there. What unfolded over the next 9 months would terrorize couples across the Pacific Northwest, creating a pattern of violence so distinctive that investigators would eventually call it the tube sock killings. 3 separate couples, 3 brutal attacks, and a signature so chilling that decades later, it still haunts the detectives who worked these cases. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. It would take revolutionary fingerprint technology and a 26-year journey to vindicate an innocent man to finally piece together the truth. Even today, parts of this case remain unsolved, and somewhere out there, a killer may still be walking free. To understand this story, you need to picture America in 1985. Ronald Reagan was president. Cell phones were luxury items for Wall Street executives. GPS didn't exist. When couples ventured into Washington's remote wilderness areas, they were truly on their own. Washington State offered some of the most beautiful landscapes in America. The Columbia River carved through dramatic canyons. Mount Rainier towered over pristine forests. For young couples seeking adventure and romance, these isolated spots seemed perfect for escaping the pressures of everyday life. Edward Smith was 25, working steadily and planning his future. Kimberly LaVine was 26, and together they represented everything hopeful about young love in America. They weren't married yet, but friends described them as inseparable, already talking about wedding plans and the life they'd build together. They had no way of knowing that someone was watching these remote areas, someone who had turned paradise into a hunting ground. Edward and Kimberly left early that Saturday morning, driving east from the Seattle area toward Grant County. Their destination was the Wanapum Dam area along Interstate 90, where the Columbia River creates some of the most spectacular views in the state. Think about their mindset that morning. They probably packed snacks, brought a camera, maybe even discussed stopping at one of those roadside diners that dot rural Washington. They were doing exactly what thousands of couples do every weekend, seeking beauty and solitude together. The last confirmed sighting placed them near the dam in the early afternoon. After that, nothing. When they failed to return home that evening, friends and family initially weren't alarmed. Maybe they decided to extend their trip, find a romantic bed and breakfast, make a spontaneous adventure of it. But the next morning, everything changed. A worker at a gravel pit near Wanapum Dam made a horrific discovery. Edward's body lay among the rocks and debris, and immediately, investigators knew this wasn't a random accident or even a typical murder. Edward's throat had been slashed. His hands were bound. But most disturbing of all was a detail that seemed almost ritualistic. A tube sock had been tied around his neck. The sock wasn't Edward's. It appeared to be a message, a signature. But a signature for what? Kimberly was nowhere to be found. Search teams combed the area for days, using helicopters and tracking dogs. The uncertainty was agonizing for her family. Was she kidnapped? Was she being held somewhere? Could she still be alive? The answer came 5 months later, and it brought no comfort. Kimberly's skeletal remains were discovered 2 miles from where Edward was found. The condition of the remains made it impossible to determine exact cause of death, but investigators were certain. Someone had murdered both of them. At this point, law enforcement treated it as an isolated incident. A tragic case, certainly, but seemingly the work of someone who knew the victims or had targeted them specifically. They had no idea they were looking at the first chapter of a much larger story. What do you think was going through the killer's mind that day? Was this planned, or did opportunity create a monster? Share your thoughts in the comments. Understanding the psychology behind these crimes might help us prevent future tragedies. August 10th, 1985. If you lived in Washington State that summer, you might remember it as unusually hot and dry. Perfect camping weather. Stephen Harkins, 27, and Ruth Cooper, 42, certainly thought so when they planned their weekend getaway to Tule Lake in Pierce County. Stephen and Ruth's relationship was relatively new but serious. They worked together at a Tacoma vocational school and had discovered they shared a love of the outdoors. Ruth was older, more experienced with wilderness camping. Stephen was eager to learn, happy to let her take the lead on their adventures. Tule Lake offered exactly what they were seeking: pristine wilderness, crystal clear water, and complete isolation from the pressures of their daily lives. They set up camp on a Friday evening, planning to spend the weekend hiking, fishing, and enjoying each other's company. But someone else was there too. The attack happened while Stephen slept. Investigators believe he never woke up. He was shot while still in his sleeping bag, an execution-style killing that suggested the perpetrator wanted to eliminate him quickly and quietly. Ruth's fate was different and far worse. Her skull was found months later, and around it was the same chilling signature, a tube sock tied with the same distinctive knots that had marked Edward Smith's murder. Suddenly, law enforcement realized they weren't dealing with isolated incidents. They had a serial killer on their hands, someone who specifically targeted couples in remote locations. Someone who had developed a ritual, a calling card that served some twisted psychological need. The tube sock signature baffled investigators. Why this particular item? What did it represent to the killer? Behavioral analysts suggested it might be a way of marking territory, claiming ownership over the victims. Others theorized it represented some deeper psychological compulsion, perhaps rooted in the killer's past. But here's what really terrified law enforcement: the locations. Both crime scenes were in popular camping and recreation areas. If this killer wasn't stopped, he could strike again anywhere couples sought privacy and natural beauty. Word of the connection between the murders spread quickly through Washington's outdoor recreation community. Campground reservations dropped. Couples who had planned romantic getaways canceled their trips. The killer had effectively weaponized fear, turning the state's natural beauty into a source of terror. Do you think the killer chose these specific locations randomly, or was there a deeper connection? Maybe he worked in outdoor recreation, or had personal memories tied to these areas. Let me know what patterns you see. Sometimes fresh eyes spot connections that investigators miss. By December, many people hoped the killer had moved on, been arrested for other crimes, or simply stopped. Christmas was approaching, and families across Washington were trying to reclaim their sense of safety and normalcy. Mike Riemer and Diana Robertson had their own Christmas tradition. Every year, they would take their young daughter into the Pierce County forests to find the perfect Christmas tree. It was exactly the kind of wholesome family activity that made the Pacific Northwest feel like paradise for young parents. Diana was excited about the tradition. Mike had recently returned from military service, and this would be one of their first family Christmases together in years. Their daughter, barely 2 years old, would probably remember little of the day, but the photos and memories would last a lifetime. They drove into the forest area on a crisp December morning, probably listening to Christmas music on the radio, their daughter babbling happily in the back seat. They were living the American dream: young family, new beginnings, creating traditions that would bind them together for decades to come. They never came home. When Diana's body was discovered in February 1986, the brutality shocked even experienced investigators. She had been stabbed 17 times. The attack showed a level of rage and violence that exceeded the previous murders. But most chilling of all, there was no sign of Mike or their daughter. This is where the story takes a turn that would haunt one family for over 2 decades. Mike Riemer had a history of domestic violence. Not severe, but documented. When police couldn't find his body, when there was no evidence he'd been attacked, when their daughter remained missing, investigators drew what seemed like the logical conclusion: Mike had killed Diana, taken their child, and disappeared. Think about the implications. Diana's family was devastated not just by her death, but by the belief that the man she loved, the father of her child, had murdered her. Mike's family faced something different but equally devastating: watching their son and brother be labeled a killer while having no way to prove his innocence. For years, Mike's family fought to clear his name. They insisted he was another victim, not the perpetrator. They pointed to the tube sock signature found with Diana's remains. They argued that Mike would never have harmed his daughter. But without his body, without concrete evidence, the cloud of suspicion remained. The case divided families and communities. Some believed Mike was a killer who had escaped justice. Others saw him as another victim of a serial predator. The truth seemed lost forever. What's your gut feeling about Mike? Do you think someone capable of domestic violence could escalate to murder, or does the tube sock signature prove he was another victim? These kinds of cases show how dangerous it can be to jump to conclusions based on limited. For years after Edward and Kimberly's murder, law enforcement got a breakthrough that would have seemed like science fiction just a decade earlier. The FBI had developed something called AFIS, the Automated Fingerprint Identification System. For the first time in history, investigators could search massive databases of fingerprints electronically, comparing evidence from crime scenes to known criminals across the entire country. The technology was revolutionary. Previously, matching fingerprints required manual comparison between evidence and known prints from specific suspects. If you didn't know who you were looking for, fingerprint evidence was essentially useless. AFIS changed that completely. When investigators ran the fingerprints from Edward and Kimberly's crime scene through the new system, they got a hit. The killer's identity was finally revealed, and he was someone already in the criminal justice system for other offenses. The arrest and conviction brought some measure of justice for Edward and Kimberly's families. After 4 years of uncertainty, they finally had answers. They knew who had murdered their loved ones and why. The killer was sentenced and would never hurt another couple in Washington's wilderness. But here's what makes this story so complex. The conviction only solved one of the 3 linked cases. Stephen Harkins and Ruth Cooper's killer was never identified. Diana Robertson's murder remained officially unsolved, with Mike Riemer still considered the primary suspect. Was it the same killer? Were there 2 different perpetrators using the same signature? Had someone copied the tube sock method after reading about it in the media? These questions would haunt investigators for decades. The technology that solved Edward and Kimberly's case also highlighted how primitive 1980s investigative methods really were. Today, we take DNA analysis, electronic databases, and computer-assisted investigations for granted. But in 1985, detectives were working with tools that hadn't changed much since the 1950s. This raises an uncomfortable question. How many other cases from this era remain unsolved simply because the technology didn't exist to solve them? How many families are still waiting for answers that modern science could provide? 26 years after Diana Robertson's murder, Mike Riemer's family finally got the answer they'd been praying for. A hiker discovered partial human remains in the same area where Diana's body had been found decades earlier. DNA testing confirmed what Mike's family had insisted all along. These were Mike's remains. The discovery changed everything. Mike hadn't killed his wife and kidnapped his daughter. He had been murdered alongside Diana, another victim of the same killer who had terrorized Washington couples throughout 1985. The tube sock signature found with Diana's remains now made perfect sense. But this vindication came with its own tragedy. Mike's parents had spent over 2 decades believing their son might be a killer, wondering if they had somehow failed to see warning signs, questioning everything they thought they knew about the child they had raised. The emotional toll was immeasurable. Even more heartbreaking was the fate of Mike and Diana's daughter. Without going into details that could violate her privacy, investigators determined what had happened to the toddler that December day. The truth brought closure, but no comfort to a family that had endured decades of uncertainty. The discovery of Mike's remains officially changed the case classification. Diana Robertson's murder was no longer considered domestic violence. It was now recognized as part of the tube sock killing series, another attack by the same predator who had stalked couples in remote locations. But this raised new questions that remain unanswered today. If the same killer murdered Diana and Mike, why wasn't he caught when AFIS identified Edward and Kimberly's murderer? Were there multiple killers using the same signature? Had the original killer inspired copycats? For Mike's family, vindication was bittersweet. They had cleared his name, but they had also lost all hope that he might somehow still be alive. They had traded the shame of believing their loved one was a killer for the grief of knowing he had died horribly, trying to protect his family. How do you think Mike's family coped with 26 years of uncertainty? What would it do to you to spend decades wondering if someone you loved was capable of murder? Share your thoughts. These human elements are often the most important part of these stories. Today, cold case investigators have tools that would have seemed magical to detectives in 1985. DNA analysis can identify suspects from the tiniest biological samples. Genetic genealogy can trace family connections across generations, identifying suspects through distant relatives who have submitted DNA to ancestry websites. These advances have revolutionized cold case investigations. Murders that remained unsolved for decades are being cracked every month. Families who had given up hope are finally getting answers. The Golden State Killer, the Green River Killer, countless other cases that seemed impossible to solve have been resolved through modern technology. But 2 of the tube sock killings remain officially unsolved. Stephen Harkins and Ruth Cooper's killer has never been identified. Diana Robertson and Mike Riemer's murderer remains unknown, despite the physical evidence linking their case to the other attacks. Why haven't these cases been solved? There are several possibilities. The killer might have died before DNA databases became comprehensive. The available evidence might be too degraded for modern analysis. The perpetrator might be someone who has never been arrested, whose DNA isn't in any criminal database. Or perhaps most disturbing of all, the killer might still be alive, still free, possibly still dangerous. Current cold case investigators haven't given up. They continue to analyze evidence using the latest technology. They follow new leads generated by genealogy databases. They hope that someone with information will finally come forward, motivated by the passage of time or changes in their own circumstances. These families deserve answers. Stephen's and Ruth's relatives deserve to know who destroyed 2 lives that showed such promise. Diana and Mike's families deserve justice for a young couple who were just trying to create Christmas memories with their daughter. The tube sock signature suggests these crimes were committed by someone with distinctive psychological patterns. Behavioral analysis indicates the killer likely had military or outdoor recreation experience, given the remote locations and tactical approach to the attacks. This person probably lived in Washington State or spent significant time there. They might have worked in forestry, camping, or outdoor recreation. What's your theory about why these cases remain unsolved? Do you think it's the same killer or multiple perpetrators? Could someone in these online comments hold a crucial piece of information without realizing? The tube sock killings changed how people in the Pacific Northwest think about outdoor recreation. Before 1985, couples routinely ventured into remote wilderness areas without considering personal safety. The idea that someone might be hunting human prey in these beautiful, isolated locations was almost unthinkable. After 1985, everything was different. Campground managers started emphasizing safety protocols. Outdoor recreation groups began traveling in larger numbers. Couples who once sought solitude began seeking safety instead. The psychological impact extended far beyond Washington State. These cases received national media attention, contributing to a growing awareness that serial killers weren't just urban phenomena. They could strike anywhere, including the places Americans went to feel most safe and free. From an investigative standpoint, these cases highlighted the importance of linking seemingly isolated crimes. If investigators hadn't recognized the tube sock signature pattern, Edward and Kimberly's case might never have been solved. The recognition that these were connected crimes led to the focused investigation that eventually identified their killer. The cases also demonstrated both the promise and limitations of technological solutions. AFIS technology solved one case, but not the others. Modern DNA analysis might eventually solve the remaining cases, but decades have passed without resolution. Technology is a powerful tool, but it's not magic. For the families involved, the legacy is deeply personal. Edward and Kimberly's relatives got justice and closure. Mike Riemer's family got vindication, but not justice. Stephen and Ruth's families continue waiting for answers that may never come. These different outcomes within the same series of crimes illustrate how arbitrary justice can be. It shouldn't depend on which specific evidence survives, which databases contain the right information, or which investigators happen to make the crucial connections. But often as I researched this story, I was struck by how much remains unknown. Despite decades of investigation, despite technological advances that would amaze 1985 detectives, 2 of these cases remain open. Someone got away with murder, possibly multiple murders. The investigation continues. Washington State cold case detectives still work these files. They still follow leads, still analyze evidence, still hope for the breakthrough that will finally bring justice to all the victims. But they need help. These cases were solved through public involvement, people who came forward with information, witnesses who remembered crucial details, family members who preserved evidence and kept investigators focused on the truth. If you lived in Washington State in 1985, if you remember anything unusual about these areas during that time, if you have any information that might be relevant, law enforcement wants to hear from you. Sometimes the smallest detail, something that seemed insignificant at the time, provides the key to solving cases decades later. Think about the power of this community we've built around true crime. Thousands of people are listening to this story, analyzing the details, thinking about connections that professional investigators might have missed. That collective intelligence has solved cases before. It could happen again. What patterns do you see that I haven't mentioned? What questions do these cases raise in your mind? Are there other unsolved cases from this era that might be connected? Share your thoughts, share your theories, share any relevant information you might have. The tube sock killings represent something larger than just 3 tragic cases from 1985. They show us how evil can intrude on our most innocent moments, how the places we go to find peace can become scenes of horror, how technology can both solve and fail to solve the puzzles that haunt us. They also show us the importance of never giving up. Mike Riemer's family fought for 26 years to clear his name, and they succeeded. Edward and Kimberly's case was solved through persistence and technological innovation. Stephen and Ruth's case, Diana and Mike's case, they might still be solved if we don't give up, if we keep pushing for answers. These victims deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in unsolved case files, but as real people who had dreams, relationships, and futures that were stolen from them. Edward and Kimberly were planning a wedding. Stephen and Ruth were building a relationship. Mike and Diana were creating family traditions with their daughter. Their killer, or killers, took all of that away. But their stories live on, and their families' fight for justice continues. In telling these stories, in analyzing these cases, in refusing to let them be forgotten, we honor their memory and support their families' ongoing search for truth. The tube sock killer's signature was meant to be a mark of power, a way of claiming ownership over these victims. Instead, it became the clue that led to justice in one case and vindication in another. It might still lead to justice in the remaining cases. Evil may have had its moment in those remote Washington forests in 1985. But truth has a way of emerging, even decades later. Technology keeps advancing. Memories resurface. People come forward. And sometimes, justice finally prevails. If you found this story compelling, if you want to see more cases like this analyzed and explained, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. You never know when breaking news might finally solve one of these cold cases, and I want to make sure you're the first to know.